Hello and welcome to another episode of what I did on my MBA today. So we are entering the fourth week. It's Monday night, mid-October already. I've gone through a month's train pass, which is a sobering thought. And in fact, tomorrow we have the last lecture in managing people, and I think that means that we have the last lecture in ops on Wednesday morning. It's quite scary because that means that feels like we've only just started, and yet we've already finished the lecture courses for the first two modules. It's quite an incredible thought because we knew this was going to go fast, but this is going really, really fast. So, what I learned today, a couple of things I'd like to talk about. First one, just to kind of follow on from what I was talking about at the end of last week around targets and bonuses and that kind of thing. I found another piece of information you might like, which is considerable amounts of research by economists, psychologists, sociologists, and so on, which suggest that across many different demographics, pure monetary reward works well for mechanical tasks, but not for anything cognitive. Which actually, in fact, when you start having cognitive tasks, a bigger monetary reward, and I think, in fact, bigger reward full stop, actually reduces performance. Now, we shouldn't really be surprised at this because we do see it in many different fields. As you know, my big thing is archery, and in archery we have almost an epidemic of what we term target panic, which is a bit like the yips in golf. It's a sudden involuntary failure to complete a shot properly, and you end up either unable to pull through or flinching a release or just uncontrollably twitching. It's a terrible thing, and most archers will suffer from it at some point, whether they know what it is or not. And I've done a lot of thinking and researching around the subject because I suffered from it myself for many years. And like I say, it's a psychological thing. It happens. You're never free of it. You just learn a bit better to recognise the symptoms and handle them. One of the big things is that it's when your brain suddenly goes, "Oh, hang on, this is important. We need to do this properly," and takes over things that you were previously doing subconsciously. So overthinking, essentially. Overthinking, not trusting, not just letting it happen, and getting out of that state of flow, which is, of course, something that you get in anything that you do. It doesn't have to be purely in emotion tasks. So what's interesting, and the reason I think that archery and golf, for instance, suffer from these more than, say, sprinting, is that in these sports we're actually having to consciously focus on a target and repress the conscious mind from actually dealing with the motion. Also, archery and golf, it's you and your target and your thing. You don't have a competitor who's doing something against you. I'm not quite sure why that makes a difference, but it really does. I think possibly because your focus is different if you're waiting for someone else to do something. If it's just you and your performance, that's a very different stress. Now, of course, at work, that is really what we have. Even if we're working in a team, it's all about what you do, what you put in. So the research are definitely showing that if there's a lot at stake from a task, a mental task, then that's going to reduce your ability to actually focus on it, ignore everything else going on around you, and actually just get on with that task with a clear mind. You'll start getting panic symptoms and confusion, poor decisions, and probably a lot of areas around cognitive, what do you call them? When your mind fixates on one thing to the exclusion of anything else. So you fixate on the first option rather than really evaluating all the options like you would normally. So that's, I thought, was very interesting. And there's going to be many more thoughts, I'm sure, to come on this subject. It's a big one, and it's a contentious one. It's one that I think needs to be looked at very closely. Now, the second thing, which I thought was very interesting, is around organisational commitment, working cultures, employee engagement, all that kind of thing. Organisational commitment is a subset where you're looking at how much, how committed people are to the company. It's not how excited and enthused they are, it's how much they would essentially stick with your company rather than go to a competitor if they were offered maybe a large sum of money or different whatever working conditions. If they're committed to your organisation, they're going to be more likely to turn down other people's offers. And these days we're talking about this, it's becoming a bit of a thing. But actually, we first started looking at organisational commitment in the 80s, which is to say that this new concept is older than I am. It's a scary thought for you. With the demographic shifts, we're seeing falling birth rate, and so by the 80s, managers were looking at demographics and saying, well, where's the next generation of the workforce actually going to come from? Because there's not enough kids coming through the system to replace all the people who are going to be retiring soon. You're looking at an ageing population, and frankly, we know this because we've been talking about ageing populations certainly the whole time I've been growing up. But nothing seems to have been done in business. And there's a very interesting reason, which is that in the late 80s, early 90s, the Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact and all that collapsed, and you had all these Eastern European countries suddenly had vast numbers of people who were able to move to fill in these jobs in Western Europe. So certainly in Europe, there wasn't this same need suddenly to find alternative way of dealing with this ageing workforce. Now, if you look in Asia, you still had higher birth rates for longer, although now demographics in many of the East Asian countries are looking quite scary in terms of that their ageing populations are going to be far more significant than they are in the West. And that's really across the region. In the US, of course, they haven't been quite so keen on the idea of, for instance, Mexican immigrants to fill in a lot of the jobs, and yet Mexico and other Latin American countries have been where a lot of the replacement talent has come from. That and higher wages to also attract people from other parts of the world, both developed and less developed. So now, of course, what we're seeing is that the Eastern European workforce boon, as it were, is being a bit depleted. The birth rates there have also fallen with rising prosperity. And so what we're looking at is, in political terms, the problem. It's a wonderful phrase, kicking the can down the road. In other words, in the can, metal can is your problem, and so rather than picking up and sticking it in the bin now, what we're going to do is just give it a good kick, and we'll come back to it in a few minutes when we've caught up to it. This is a thing politicians do all the time, and that's what seems to have been done in business. The can got kicked down the road, and now, coming up to 2020, we're looking at exactly the same problem that they were looking at in the 80s, except what exactly, who's going to replace it now? And this does shed quite different light on things like technological obsolescence of jobs, robots and all that, because actually we might be struggling to find humans anyway. But that means we're going to need a political solution as well, because one of the reasons that people are so concerned is that, of course, retirement ages are rising. And retirement ages are not rising because we can't fill jobs, they're rising because people can't afford to retire. So we are going to need to find some way of dealing with this. And coming from a politics background, I have to say that yet again, we are seeing a lot of things that Marx talked about as late stage capitalism manifested in today's society. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see where that goes over the next few years. Certainly feels like we're heading towards quite a major decision point. Then, of course, the final thing I'd like to mention on that is we're saying in the 80s, how to explain this properly? In the 80s, people were looking at falling birth rates and saying, we're going to need to do something because we're not going to be able to find workers. Now, in the past, this is not really a new phenomenon in the 80s. You'd had mechanisation and automation happening before that, and that had always been the answer. We're going to increase workforce productivity through various impressive technological things. But in the 90s and early 2000s, companies have been able to essentially lower incomes. This is where you have this whole stagnant middle, squeezed middle, all that kind of thing coming from, is that your typical middle income jobs have actually had their wages reduced at the same time that the very top have been getting richer. And in fact, in the US, they're saying the middle class now is actually shrinking quite dramatically, and this is really a very negative thing for society as a whole. But could it be? I know that it's certainly in the UK, we're talking about a productivity crisis, which is to say that we're making people work longer hours for less pay, but in terms of what's actually being produced, there's a massive shortfall. The productivity isn't increasing. Now, there's a few different areas that you can look at. One, certainly the Panama Papers shed a bit of light on this. Where's all that economic activity going? Well, might be hidden in some very shady offshore bank accounts. Certainly, if you look at some of the estimates around that, it's a very significant proportion of economic productivity is just being hidden, and that's bad for everyone, apart from the couple of billionaires who own it all. But the other side of it is, are we seeing a reduced productivity because actually we're making our workforce less effective by, as I say, kicking the can down the road and hiring people with less skills, less money to do these jobs? It's an interesting question. Could this actually be the answer to the productivity crisis? And if so, how does it work? How does it work is a big one. Yeah, so I think I'll leave that there because there's some big thoughts there to take in, and I certainly don't have any answers. There's a few people out there like Piketty who are looking at these things very seriously, but I'm not going to stick myself in that boat. Much I'd like to. Yeah, so we'll leave it there. That's some interesting things, and I hope you find them interesting as well. Be seeing you.